Hello, I'm Dr. Kimberly Douglas, and I am the chief contributor to the Substack, The Learning Landscape, where we are mapping 21st century learning. Today, I'm trying to think, do I even have a title today? Maybe it's bottom up versus top down. What I want to do today is make some things explicit and very clear about the meaning of the Substack and how the thoughts that I put out every week, like where this is coming from. And I want to start with a comparison between bottom up analysis versus top down analysis. When you think about everything that you read in the Substack or you've listened to in the Substack, it has been based upon a bottom up analysis. So, in formal research and academic environments, we might speak of grounded analysis, grounded theory. But here, when I'm talking about bottom up analysis, I'm talking about looking at the pieces that are out there in the landscape and developing a picture based upon the pieces that we see. Whereas a more top-down view of education in the the educational landscape would be we start with an idea or a general understanding, general overview of what's happening out there, and then try to make those pieces fit. So, but inside of an academic situation, we would look at the pieces, and I'll give you some examples here in a moment. Look at the pieces, look at what's happening in the landscape, and we would develop theory from that, or we would put together themes from that, or thematic analysis. And then inside of academia, what we would do from a top-down basic research approach is we would start with a broad theory and then make all of the data that we collect fit or examine how it fits or does not fit with that broad theory. But out here in the rest of the world, I'm just going to talk about a bottom up approach. When I say bottom up, with regard to the learning landscape, just think about all the things that I've covered over the past few weeks. What I've been trying to do is piece together a picture of what the landscape looks like. So last week I talked about learning hubs inside of gig platforms. I've also talked about podcasts. I've mentioned gaming, traditional institutions. They are absolutely part of the landscape. Um, Industry training, community colleges under that heading of traditional institutions. All of these are pieces that I am observing in a broad landscape to help create this picture, to develop, to identify, make visible the patterns that are out there. The lessons are coming from the bottom up because we are scanning, we are surveying the landscape, and the lessons are coming from the bottom up versus the top down with traditional mandates of how things are supposed to be done. And so, if we're looking at things from the bottom up, we are taking note of where things are happening without trying to impose and say that this is supposed to be happening here, this is supposed to be learned there. So the first part of this is to understand where learning is actually happening. But even before that, defining what learning is and what it means um, to develop skills and get new concepts. So having clear definitions about that. And so for me, learning is both a cognitive and an emotional process that happens with both the brain and the body, and with the nervous system. And that happens in many different places where you acquire a skill or something that helps you solve a problem or answers a question for you. Okay. With a bottom up approach, the pieces that we see out in the landscape are telling us the story. We piece it together to tell the story, as opposed to top down, where we tell the story and then flip the pieces. So that's very different than a lot of ways that people typically approach education. One of the things we have to talk about here, or I think is very important to talk about, and I am drawing on my experience with information science and actually going to read a little bit from a book that has this is the book. It's called Theories of Information Behavior. I don't have the reverse screen, but Theories of Information Behavior. And it's actually, it was the first imprint of it was 2008. So it's a little bit dated. And when I get curious about things and I want to overview because it delivers information in short bursts in this book, I go back to this, I reference this book just to kind of get me going. And I'm going to read something from the book here in just a moment. This book is based on information behavior. And when I think about what the pieces look like in the landscape, I think about what behavior drives people to the places where they are learning things. So we have to talk about information seeking. In order for this to be a learner focused or learner centered concentric conversation, we have to talk about information seeking. But before we talk about that, I want to clarify something that if we're going to learn from the various pieces and parts that appear in the landscape, it's important to be clear that we are not in the information age. And that's an important point to make, because if you think that we are in the information age, then it frames what we're doing here in a way that is misleading. We are not in the information age because the problem of information, the lack of information, has been mostly resolved. So there's so much information out there being generated, pretty much anything that you need you can find today. So, that kind of lines up with the phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. Could something totally new be created? Perhaps. But by and large, most information that we need for our existence already exists. Some people call this the attention age. A couple of other terms or phrases I'd like to throw out here is the experience age or the experiential age. So in terms of teaching, I want to direct our attention to the experience age or the experiential age. People can go get the information, and they have plenty of sources to go get information without paying for them, or they could pay for them. There are places for them to go. What they're looking for from us is experiences or experiential opportunities with us. So that distinction is important, because if it's just about information, then the traditional institutions should satisfy whatever needs exist. But we know that that's not happening. We know it's not happening in K-12. We know it's not happening in higher education. We know that people are going to Dungeons and Dragons groups. We know that people are going to other games, role play games, video games. We know that people are going to podcasts. We know that people are going to TED Talks. We know that people are going to all kinds of affinity groups. We know that people are going to social media influencers to get their information needs met, to learn things, because those places, those platforms, they're going to learning hubs inside of gigs. I talked about this in the Substack last week. They're going to these places, they're going to these people, they're going to these communities to get these needs met, because they aren't just looking for information, they're also looking for an experience as well. And that's why, one of the reasons why it's important to kind of take this bottom-up approach, so we can look at not only the information that's being provided, but the experiences that are being provided that attract people to these various sites. So when you think about top down, so if we're staying at this conversation top down education, top down offerings in terms of education and learning opportunities, we think about things like accreditation and testing and quizzes and reviews and checks. We think mostly about how this is going to impact industry and what industry is going to be able to get from what we teach people. From a bottom-up perspective, we can then start to look at what kind of experience is the learner having? What is the impact to the individual? What is the impact to the community? But then also, what is the impact to industry as well? So it's a little disappointing um, because we are not taking time to get a lay of the land. We are not taking time to understand the experiential opportunities, the experiences that are being provided to for people to learn out here in the learning landscape. It's a little disappointing when I hear conversations about literacy because usually what people mean is that you cannot pass a test or that you they try to quantify like a reading comprehension level. And all of those things are valid and important, but to take a very top-down approach, like this is what you should be learning, and then everything else fits into that, to take that very top-down approach, it leaves out an important part of the conversation because a lot of the top-down conversation is being driven by entities like testing companies. And I'm also hearing this very top-down approach from educators who actually don't understand what type of literacy is needed in 2025. And I see this a lot around the conversation regarding AI and um, actively telling people to just not use AI. That is not a solution for this day and age. And in fact, having AI literacy is a critical part of literacy in 2025. And so, if we're not taking a lay of the land, we're not understanding where people are going for their information and their learning experiences, then we are missing out on opportunities to go to this book. And I'm going to read a bulleted list that are part of this information seeking theory that describes the type of activities that people participate in when they are seeking information and plug this into the conversation about the bottom up approach. This adds a little bit of nuance to that conversation. So, the propositions of this theory were the underlying complex patterns of information seeking behavior. Let me start again. The propositions of the theory were that underlying the complex patterns of information seeking behavior were a relatively small number of types of activity characterized as number one, starting, activities of the initial search for information. And I'll say a little bit more about these in just a moment. So, starting is the first one. Where do people start to find information? Chaining, following chains of citations or other forms of referential connection between material. Browsing, semi directed searching in an area of potential interest. Differentiating, using differences between sources as a filter on the nature and quality of material examined. Monitoring, maintaining awareness of developments in a field through the monitoring of particular sources. And extracting, systematically working through a particular source to locate material of interest. Now, for context, and again, this was written in 2008. For context, I think what they're mostly talking about is you think about researching for a research paper, but we are far beyond that. You think about if you were to take these steps, starting, chaining, browsing, differentiating, monitoring, extracting, and think about them in the context of information that you would get from a podcast or within a gaming community. And think about what would entice you to start. And sometimes when you're information seeking, you may not be fully aware that you are information seeking. But the thing that sticks out to me is how many social factors would be involved in a person even starting or chaining or browsing or differentiating or monitoring or extracting. The social process is inseparable from the cognitive and the information seeking process. The social process is heavily is deeply a part of this information seeking process. And so, going back to this bottom up approach, if we don't take time to look at these steps that people engage in information seeking, the starting, the chaining, the browsing, the differentiating, the monitoring, and the extraction, then we miss a big part of what's happening here. If we start with this is where people should be starting with information, this is where people should be chaining, this is how people should be browsing, this is how people should be differentiating, this is how people should be monitoring, this is how people should be extracting information and working through a source to locate material interest. If that is our starting place, then a lot more people appear to be illiterate to us. They appear to be non-functional within that information system. But the starting place for me is let's find out where these things are actually happening. And the way that we're able to do that is to try to be as neutral as possible in just observing the places where these things are happening. And accept that learning is happening in those spaces. It could be in a traditional institution, it could be in a traditional classroom, it could be on the shop floor at a community college, but it could also be in a podcast. It could also be on a gig app in a learning hub inside a gig app. It could also be on a learning platform or learning management system outside of academia. It could also be on a gaming platform. It could be a face-to-face tabletop gaming situation, or it could be a video game platform or an electronic role play game platform. It could be in all of these places, but we have to start from the bottom up to really understand. And I just wanted to take time to clarify that this week, that as you experience, how I am thinking about things, and if we have, when we have contributors, how they are thinking about things, as you take all that in, I just want to provide this framework for you, this guidance for you, that this is very bottom up. It's very bottom up. It is saying, you know what? Let me just look out there and let me see what's out there. Before I wrap up, I'm going to stick in one more thing here. So just ask for your patience here for a second. I am going to, because one of the things I want to do is I want to try to make things hold together as much as possible. And give me just a moment here. I'll do this real quick. Hold on. While this comes up, I am going to go back to the Douglas tenets of modern education. And I'm going to loop back to that. I'm going to go back to that. And I'm going to connect that to this conversation about this bottom-up approach. Just patience here for a second. Okay. So if you go back through the Substack, you'll see a whole series that I did to reset the Substack. And I was talking about the Douglas Tenets of Modern Education by me, Dr. Kimberly Douglas. And I'm going to go back and read this list. This is a check for me as well as for you, because I want to make sure I'm making this connection about the bottom up approach. Okay. So the first one is that the learning environment is wherever people already live, play, research, study, work, and worship. Okay. So where's all of this happening? People are learning at churches. Now, I'm not talking about the quality of what they're learning, or I'm not qualifying what they're learning in any way. That's not the point right now. The point right now is that people are willing learners in these spaces. There are spaces where they're choosing to go learn without a sense of obligation attached. In some cases, there is a sense of, in the more traditional environments, maybe a sense of obligation attached, but also they're learning in many places where that's not the case. Okay, formal education in structured environments is only part of the education needed to develop 21st century skills. All digital platforms are learning platforms. I think that still fits within this bottom up view of things. All communication methods are teaching methods. So by saying that, that gives us the opportunity to look at everything that's happening out there, all the ways that we are talking to each other and communicating and distributing and disseminating ideas. The teacher is the learner is the teacher. So in these spaces where we're talking about a bottom-up approach, where are these exchanges happening? How are these exchanges happening? Relationship is the foundation of learning. So another way to map everything that's happening is look at where these relationships are forming. So that's another layer of the map that we could look at. Okay, people need to learn to know how to judge things as well as produce things. So, where in the landscape are people learning critical analysis, learning to discern and separate things and compartmentalize things in certain ways? Learning experiences are nervous system experiences. And so we can look and see how people are cognitively and somatically, how their minds and their bodies are being affected in the environment. Learners are neurodiverse. So we look at the complexity of people or the diversity and the complexity, I don't know if complexity, but the diversity among people who learn and who learn by the very existence continuing to exist every day. And then teaching and learning involve power dynamics. And so part of mapping this landscape by parsing, like picking these things apart and not taking a top-down approach of this is what you should be learning, and maybe and being more careful and saying this is what people and investigating first and saying that this is what people are actually learning and this is how it's impacting people. This is how it's impacting relationships, one-to-one relationships. This is how it's impacting group dynamics. This is how it's impacting community dynamics. This is how it's impacting industry. So by taking that view of let's just see what's out there first before dictating what should be out there, this actually gives us a window into the future because the whole thing is about the future. This is a very futurist minded approach to education. The whole thing about futurism is there are a lot of people in the environment who say that they're futurists and that they're reading the data, they're doing a meta analysis and doing predictive analytics. Some of them are doing that, but a lot of them are just planning the future that they want. It's not necessarily based on anything that they can go find analytics to match their ambitions and their desires and their desire to create toys for the future. And that's fine, but that's not necessarily like um, futurism as the way that they've defined it. And I'm saying here, let's see what the landscape looks like. Let's see what the people are saying that they need. And let's do futurism this way so that it isn't just about the toys and innovations that you can create and the control you can have, but it's about the things that people really want to learn to impact, to have the kind of lives that they want to have. So this is the talk about bottom up versus top down. I think that will be the title. I'm not sure. But thank you for listening, and I'm going to continue to develop this throughout the week. I appreciate you being here. Make sure you're commenting, you're sharing, or restacking here on Substack. Make sure you're resharing. And also, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. This is subscriber supported content, and really would appreciate your support. It makes it so that I can devote time and attention to developing these ideas. And I just want to say that these are what I'm providing here are meta kind of some of it's not meta, but like meta conversations where we can really imagine what things could be like. But part of imagining what they could be like is being honest about what they actually are right now. So let's continue that conversation. Continue to like the best thing that you can do right now is to engage and connect. And if you want to talk one-to-one about anything that you've heard here, I'm happy to talk to you about it. Or if you want to do go live, you want to co-sponsor something, then that's always a possibility. But I appreciate your time and I certainly appreciate your attention. Take care. Goodbye.